Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story.
What would you do if your neighbor started parking in your driveway every single day? And when you asked her to stop, she claimed she had all a right to it. I tried being nice, but then she handed me a legal document that gave me all the power. So what did I do? I gave her exactly what she asked for.
I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd end up in a petty dispute with a neighbor, but here we are, and honestly, I don't regret a single second of it. So, some background. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people wave at each other, mind their own business, and generally get along. My house has this unusually wide driveway. It's probably about 1.5 times the width of a normal driveway. The previous owners had it expanded because they had a small RV and needed the extra space. I don't have an RV, but I appreciated the extra room. It meant I could park my car, my wife could park hers, and we'd still have space for guests, or if one of us needed to do some work on a vehicle. It's nice, it's convenient, and most importantly, it's mine. Enter the neighbor. She moved in next door about 8 months ago. Younger than me, probably late 20s, drove a white BMW, always had designer sunglasses perched on her head. The kind of person who looked like she'd never heard the word no in her life. I'm not trying to be mean, but you know the type. Everything about her screamed, "I'm used to getting my way." For the first few weeks, things were fine. We waved at each other in passing, exchanged pleasantries about the weather, standard neighbor stuff. Her driveway was normal size, just wide enough for 2 cars if you were careful about it. She usually parked in her garage and had 1 car in the driveway, no problems. Then one day, I came home from work and found her car parked in my driveway. Not halfway in, not accidentally over the line. Fully parked, right there in the middle of my driveway like it belonged there. I sat in my car for a minute, just staring at it, trying to figure out if I was missing something. Was there construction I didn't know about? Had she locked her keys in her house and needed somewhere to park temporarily? I couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation, so I got out and knocked on her door. She answered with a bright smile, like nothing was unusual. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "I noticed your car's in my driveway. Is everything okay? Do you need me to move something, or—" She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh yeah, I hope you don't mind. I have a friend coming over later and I wanted to save the driveway space for her. Your driveway is so big I figured you wouldn't even notice." I blinked at her. "But I do need to park there. That's my driveway." She looked at me like I was being unreasonable. "Can't you just park on the street for tonight? It's not a big deal." "I'd rather park in my own driveway," I said, keeping my voice level. "If you could move your car, I'd appreciate it." She sighed like I was inconveniencing her, but she grabbed her keys and moved the car. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, her car was in my driveway again. This time when I knocked, she said she'd move it in a bit because she was in the middle of something. I waited 20 minutes before she finally came out and moved it, and she made a big show of huffing and acting put out. Then it happened again and again. By the 5th time in 2 weeks, I was done being polite. I knocked on her door and told her firmly that she couldn't keep parking in my driveway. It was my property. I needed it for my own vehicles, and I needed her to stop. She looked me up and down like she was evaluating a used car she wasn't sure she wanted to buy. Then she said, "You're making a really big deal out of nothing. It's just a parking space." "It's my parking space," I said. She actually laughed at me. Said I was being ridiculous and that neighbors should help each other out. I told her helping out occasionally was one thing, but she was treating my driveway like it was hers. She rolled her eyes, said she'd try to remember not to park there, and closed the door. Spoiler alert, she did not try to remember. The next week, I came home to find her car in my driveway 3 times. The 3rd time, I left a note on her windshield. It was polite but clear. "Please do not park in my driveway. This is private property. Thank you." She threw the note away, parked there again the next day. That's when I decided to escalate. I did some research and found out what my options were. Turns out, if someone parks on your private property without permission, you can have them towed. You just need clear signage indicating it's private property and that unauthorized vehicles will be towed. So I bought a sign, a big one, mounted it right at the entrance to my driveway. It read, "Private driveway, no parking. Violators will be towed at owner's expense." Standard stuff, but I made sure it was big enough that nobody could claim they didn't see it. I also sent her a letter, a proper one, not just a note. I kept a copy for myself and had it delivered with signature confirmation. The letter explained that my driveway was private property, that she did not have permission to park there, and that any future violations would result in her vehicle being towed at her expense. I kept the tone professional and factual. I even mentioned the sign, just so there was no ambiguity. She signed for the letter on a Tuesday afternoon. I know, because I got the confirmation email. Thursday evening, her car was in my driveway again. I stood there, staring at it, genuinely amazed. The sign was right there. She'd gotten the letter, and yet, here we were. I knocked on her door. She answered, saw me, and immediately got defensive. "What now?" she said. "Your car is in my driveway again," I said. "I sent you a letter. There's a sign. You need to stop." She crossed her arms. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but you have all this space, and you're not even using it half the time. I don't see why it's such a big deal." "Because it's my property," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You don't get to decide how I use it." She said, and I remember this clearly because it was so absurd, that since she'd been parking there for weeks and I hadn't done anything about it at first, she had just as much right to the space as I did. She called it shared parking, and said that's just how things worked in neighborhoods. I told her that wasn't how property rights worked. She told me I was being a bad neighbor. I told her she was trespassing. She slammed the door in my face. Fine. I'd warned her. I went back inside, looked up the number for a local towing company and called them. Explained the situation, that I had a vehicle parked on my private property without permission and that I had clear signage posted. They said they'd send someone out. They were there in about 40 minutes. The driver took photos of the sign, photos of the car, and then hooked it up. The neighbor must have heard the noise because she came running out of her house, screaming. "What are you doing?" she yelled at the driver. "Towing a vehicle from private property," he said calmly. "You can pick it up at the impound lot." He handed her a card with the address and fees. She turned to me, her face bright red. "Are you kidding me right now? You're seriously having me towed?" "I warned you multiple times," I said. "You ignored me. Actions have consequences." She called me some names I won't repeat here, said I was going to regret this, and that she was going to make my life hell. Then she stormed off to get a ride to the impound lot. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I came home and found a letter taped to my front door. It was from the neighbor. She'd apparently typed it up, printed it out, and had it notarized. I guess she thought getting a notary stamp would make her nonsense legally binding or something. The letter claimed that she had established overflow parking rights to my driveway through continuous use, and that my decision to have her towed was a violation of neighborhood courtesy and possibly harassment. She demanded that I formally acknowledge her right to use the space and cease any further towing. I read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. This woman genuinely believed that parking in my driveway without permission for a few weeks gave her legal rights to it. I made a copy of the letter for my records and then drafted a response. I kept it brief and factual. I stated that she had no legal right to my property, that her claims were baseless, and that if she continued to park in my driveway, she would continue to be towed. I also mentioned that if she continued to harass me, I'd consider pursuing a restraining order. I had this letter reviewed by a real estate attorney friend of mine just to make sure I wasn't saying anything that could get me in trouble, and then I sent it via certified mail. But here's where things got really interesting and where the neighbor made her biggest mistake. About a week after she got my cease and desist letter, she came to my door with a printed document. She'd apparently been stewing over the whole situation and decided to go on the offensive. She handed me this document, and I'm not kidding, it was laid out like some kind of official parking agreement. The document stated that she was formally requesting I establish clear and consistent parking enforcement for my driveway. She wrote that if I was going to claim exclusive use of the space, I needed to prove I was seriously enforcing it by having any unauthorized vehicle towed immediately, not just when it was convenient for me. She said that if I didn't enforce it consistently, it proved I didn't actually care about the space, and she should be allowed to use it. The document went on to say that she'd be monitoring my enforcement and that if I allowed any vehicles to park there without taking action, she'd use that as evidence that my property claims were arbitrary and unfair. She actually wrote that I needed to tow every single unauthorized vehicle without exception if I wanted to be taken seriously. She stood there with her arms crossed while I read it, like she'd just delivered some kind of checkmate. I looked up at her and asked if she was serious. She said absolutely. That she was tired of my selective enforcement, and that if I was going to make a big deal about parking, I needed to be consistent about it. I told her I'd think about it. She smiled, clearly thinking she'd won something, and went back to her house. Here's the thing. I realized she'd just handed me the perfect weapon. She'd literally demanded in writing that I tow every unauthorized vehicle immediately and without exception. She'd insisted on it, so that's exactly what I did. For about 2 weeks, she didn't park in my driveway. I thought maybe she'd finally learned her lesson. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, I was inside working when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked out the window, and sure enough, it was her BMW. I didn't even go inside to think about it. I just pulled out my phone and called the tow truck. After all, the neighbor had insisted I enforce parking immediately and without exception. I was just doing exactly what she'd demanded. They were there in about 40 minutes. I stood on my porch and watched as they hooked up her car. The neighbor came running out of her house halfway through the process, screaming at the driver to stop. He calmly explained that he was removing a vehicle from private property at the owner's request, and that she could pick up her car at the impound lot. She turned to me, absolutely red in the face, and started yelling about harassment and how this was ridiculous. I pulled out the document she'd given me and read from it. I told her I was simply following her demands for immediate and consistent enforcement of parking violations. I said she'd insisted I tow unauthorized vehicles without exception, and I was complying with her request. She sputtered that she didn't mean her car, that the demand was about being fair to everyone. I told her I was being fair. I was treating everyone equally by towing anyone who parked on my property without permission, just like she'd demanded. She'd gotten exactly what she asked for: clear, consistent, immediate enforcement. She tried to argue that I was twisting her words, but I pointed out that her document didn't say to tow everyone except her. It said to tow every unauthorized vehicle without exception. Her car was unauthorized. Therefore, it got towed. Simple compliance with her demands. She stood there for a moment, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, before she finally just screamed in frustration and went back inside. You'd think that would be enough, right? Wrong. 2 weeks later, she had a party. I'm not talking about a small get-together. I'm talking about cars lining the street, music loud enough to hear from inside my house, people everywhere. And where did several of her guests decide to park? You guessed it, my driveway. I counted 3 cars. 3. I had the towing company's number saved in my phone at this point, and the dispatcher recognized my number when I called. She told me they'd be out as soon as they had a truck available in my area. I said that was fine, and that I actually had 3 vehicles that needed towing. They sent 2 trucks, cleared out all 3 cars in under an hour. The neighbor came outside when she realized what was happening, and she was furious. She started yelling at me in front of all her guests, calling me petty, saying I was ruining her party, that I was a horrible person. Her friends were recording on their phones, probably thinking they were going to capture some viral moment of me being the bad guy. I just looked at her and said, "You demanded consistent enforcement. I'm being consistent." She tried to argue, but honestly, what could she say? Her guests had parked on my property. I had clear signage. I'd warned her multiple times. This was entirely predictable. The party pretty much died after that. Hard to keep the vibe going when 3 people have to leave to pick up their cars from impound. After the 3rd towing, my wife asked if I was ever going to just let it go. She said most people would have learned their lesson by now, but the neighbor seemed almost obsessed with proving some kind of point. I told her I wasn't going to back down. The neighbor had made this a battle of wills, and I wasn't going to lose. My wife sighed but didn't push it. She knew I was right, even if she thought I was being a bit stubborn about it. The neighbor tried a few more times over the next couple of months. Each time I had her towed. After the 4th towing, she tried a different approach. She filed a complaint with the city. The complaint claimed that my driveway was too wide and encroached on what was supposed to be a public right-of-way or utility easement. She argued that I was illegally using public space and that the city should investigate. I got a letter from the city's code enforcement office asking me to provide documentation of my property lines and driveway permits. I was annoyed, but I complied. I dug up the property survey from when I bought the house, found the original permits for the driveway expansion, and submitted everything to the city. I also included a letter explaining the situation with the neighbor, her repeated trespassing, and the fact that this complaint was clearly retaliatory. About 6 weeks later, the neighbor got a letter from the city. I know this because she came to my door, waving it in my face, absolutely livid. Turns out the city had reviewed my documentation, confirmed that my driveway was entirely on my property and properly permitted, and found her complaint to be without merit. They also fined her for filing a false complaint. Not a huge fine, maybe a couple $100, but enough to sting. She screamed at me, said I'd somehow tricked the city, that this was all my fault. I told her that if she'd just respected my property from the beginning, none of this would have happened. She told me to go to hell and stormed off. Things were quiet for a while after that. She stopped parking in my driveway, stopped talking to me entirely, which was fine by me. I figured she'd finally accepted defeat. Then about 3 months after the city complaint incident, I saw a for sale sign go up in her yard. She was moving. I'm not saying the parking situation was the only reason. Maybe she got a new job, maybe she just didn't like the neighborhood. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't at least a little bit pleased. The day the moving truck showed up, I happened to be outside working in my garage and I saw her loading boxes. We didn't talk. She shot me one last glare as she got in her car and that was it. I never saw her again. The new neighbors who moved in are great, quiet, respectful, and they've never once parked in my driveway. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I was too harsh. If maybe I should have just let her park there occasionally to keep the peace, but then I remember how entitled she was, how she genuinely believed she had a right to my property, and how she escalated at every opportunity. She could have just apologized and stopped after the first towing. Instead, she doubled down, tried to claim legal rights to my driveway, filed false complaints, and made my life difficult for months. So no, I don't regret it. She tried to take advantage of me, and I stood my ground. Sometimes being a good neighbor means setting boundaries and enforcing them. And sometimes when someone pushes hard enough, you push back harder. My driveway is mine. It always was, and it always will be. And if anyone else ever tries to claim otherwise, well, I've got a towing company on speed dial. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Long story long, a corporate thrift store launched branded reusable bags around the same time they brought in self-checkouts as the predominant point of sale. I bought one on a previous visit, then brought it back to the store to reuse as intended. It got me a mild story to tell. This is a lighter story on the malice because I meant very little malice, but the other party would definitely see it that way. I shopped, then checked out of the self-checkout. Note that the reusable bags were available for purchase right by the self-checkouts. I had to buy a 20C paper bag to accommodate some lightweight purchases because I had a heavier object meant for my sturdier reusable bag and hadn't brought any others. When I got to my car, I took a minute to Bluetooth my phone and look at my receipt. Then the front-end clerk knocked on my window. She accused me of stealing the bag. I showed her my receipt with the 20C paper bag charge on it, thinking she meant that one, but she insisted I'd stolen the reusable one. She then asked me sternly to come inside and talk to her manager. One thing people ought to know is that almost every corporate retail establishment, in North America at least, prohibits employees from chasing or apprehending thieves. And this would have been the pettiest theft in the store, aside from a CD or some small earrings. So I was about to get her in trouble. I don't like dunking on minimum wage workers. Been there, barely survived. But she really needed to know just how unsafe her actions could have been if she pulled that on someone else who's a lot more hot-headed. So I went in with my receipt, purchases, and bags. I wasn't going to explain it to her. I wanted her to understand and hear me out properly, not just Karen people out of view of cameras and management. It's just not safe, end of story, and I stand both feet on that matter. I waited for the manager, with whom I'm acquainted as a regular shopper, then explained what had happened. I had to ask the employee to stop talking over me and let me finish, as the manager had asked for my story first, and I wanted to finish speaking. The manager had to ask her to stop too. I explained straight away that I'd bought the reusable bag the week before, and of course brought it to reuse on this visit. The manager was like, well, duh, that's what they're for, I'm all right. Great, glad to have that settled because the employee assumed I'd stolen it, and that's what led to me coming inside to speak with her. When I'd explained what had happened with the employee, I reminded the manager that her employee had no business following customers out to the car, and I had come in as a small favor to help her learn not to do that again for her own safety. Manager agreed, and we said some chatty goodbyes in which I included the employee so there were fewer bad vibes. She wasn't there for the next few weeks, so I asked my friend, the production manager there at the time, what happened. Apparently she was canned for violating that safety protocol because she'd been warned about following people and accusing people of theft and tag swapping when she was supposed to be at the tills. It's too bad, but I hope she pivoted into being some sort of plainclothes LP ghoul instead. Gotta work with your motivation and skill set. The next one is an entitled people story. I'm disabled and use crutches for short distances and a wheelchair for long ones. I just read a Reddit post about a driver stealing several handicap stalls at once, and it triggered a memory. One snowy winter day, I headed off to the library for my weekly book haul. The library had several handicap parking spots out front, but only one ramp. As I pull up, I noticed a stretch limo, no placard, parked in a handicapped spot. He was also parked directly on top of the only wheelchair ramp. I was furious. It had snowed that day and it was already going to be a struggle just getting into the library. Now, I would have to roll down the street, dodging cars, until I got to the closest ramp 1 block over. I briefly considered canceling the library and putting off my book fix, but I'm one determined human being and decided this was a mountain I was prepared to die on. Standing, I'm a little over 5 feet, but seated in my chair, I'm the height of a small child. Because of this, cars don't always see me in my wheelchair when I have to share the road with them. Consequently, I've been hit by cars twice because someone was too lazy to walk a few extra feet to a store door or wanted to build their ego by stealing a handicap spot. Rolling a wheelchair through deep snow and ice is absolutely hell. The wheelchair wheels get clogged with snow or ice and lose traction. That means triple the effort is required to get through. You can protect your hands with gloves, but as soon as your gloves get wet, they slide on the metal rail and won't grip. So, you need to go barehanded to keep rolling. In extreme cold, your wet hands freeze to the metal rail, and each time you remove them to keep propelling your chair, you rip off a thin layer of frozen skin. The snow, ice, dirt, and road salt transfer to your hands as you move. You get small cuts on your hands from the sharp snow, ice, and debris. The salt gets in the open cuts and makes them sting. By the time you get to your goal, your hands are frozen, dirty, bloody, and in agony. Because of this lazy limo driver, I would have to roll hundreds of feet through deep snow while dodging cars rather than the few dozen safe feet to the library that access to the ramp would provide. By the time I'd parked my car and gotten into my wheelchair, I was red-hot furious. The snow was about 8 inches high, but I was so mad I was practically flying through it to get to the limo driver's side window. When I got there, the driver and I locked eyes. He suddenly noticed something particularly spellbinding on the floor mat. I realized his plan was to ignore me. I lost my fragile grip on my temper and completely lost my crap. I grabbed my reacher and began repeatedly whacking his window with all my might while screaming at him to move his ducking limo. I continued until enough rage was spent that rational thinking was possible. He continued to pretend I didn't exist. I yelled that I was getting his license plate and giving him an expensive ticket for Christmas. As I started heading towards the back of his limo, he quickly reversed and floored the gas to back out. Because it was a stretch limo, the front end swung dangerously close to me before he exited the stall and sped off. I was too angry to be scared and serenaded his departure with a few choice words and gestures. There were numerous other parking spots as the miserable day had made most people stay home. So, he parked in a handicapped stall and on the ramp deliberately. I hope my reaction cured him of the urge to ever steal a handicapped stall again. The next one is an entitled parent story. I am 30 years old, female, 42 weeks pregnant, and getting an induction tomorrow. To try to make a long story short, my parents live out of state. I am low contact with my mother and no contact with my father. Lately, they have been acting weird and constantly swinging between being completely absent and overly involved. During a recent trip back home for my great-grandmother's funeral, my father tried to get physically aggressive with my husband while I was 5 months pregnant. The tipping point? We had a conversation about nutrition in the home while I was growing up, and I pointed out that everyone in our family is super morbidly obese, including me, until I learned how to eat using a food scale and calorie counting. The conversation turned vile and strange, and my father kept dragging things from my childhood into it to try to turn my husband against me. Honestly, the whole day had already been exhausting. From the moment we got into their car at the airport, my parents were arguing over the stupidest things. Little underhanded comments, constant bickering about traffic, and fighting with the GPS system in the car. My poor husband was so drained by the time lunch came around, and it was obvious. After the knockdown, drag-out fight my father decided to instigate, he went outside. My husband told my mother that we would be getting our own Airbnb and that he was not going to stand by and watch his wife be denigrated and spoken down to like that. I love him for that. When my mother ran off to tell my father we were leaving, my father busted into our room and began wagging his finger in my face, trying to get me to go talk with him alone. No doubt so he could berate me. I said, "No, we can just leave. We're adults." My husband then politely asked him to leave the room. My father kept pushing his weird, macho ego into the worst possible place and escalated it again by threatening physical violence. For reference, my husband is 30, a former sergeant in the 82nd Airborne, currently a working rancher, and in great shape. My father is in his mid-60s, around 350 pounds, and on oxygen from interstitial lung disease. The absolute last thing my husband wanted was confrontation. I do not even remember how it ended, despite being sitting right there on the bed, but my father eventually left. He convinced my mother to drive him home, which was about an hour away from where we were staying. My mother begged us not to leave and insisted we could still have a good weekend and attend my grandmother's memorial together. So we stayed. There were a few hiccups with my mother's strange behavior because she is always lying, covering for my father, drinking way too much around her side of the family, and treating every social gathering like a party instead of what it actually was, a funeral. But overall, nothing egregious happened. Fast forward to today. I am pretty low contact with my mother and I have not spoken to my father since. Good riddance. My mother acts like we are much closer than we actually are. I was expected to deliver around July 5th, 2026, but my son decided to take his sweet time. Because I am a small woman, my OBGYN and I decided it would be best to induce on July 19th, 2026 to reduce the risk of a C-section or other complications. I had my induction scheduled at my last OB appointment on July 3rd, 2026. I told my mother that if she wanted to come out to the state where I live, it would be best to do so on or around July 19th, because regardless of whether he came earlier, he would definitely be coming that day. My mother has been super involved over the last couple of days, texting or calling every day to see if there are any changes. Every time I say no, just still planning on inducing. Finally, I confronted her and asked what she was planning for this trip. She had sent a box full of baby items that I could tell came from the dollar store. Rattles, stuffed animals, and things like that. Most of them were already falling apart and had to be thrown away because they were obvious choking hazards. Months ago, she told me that she and her friend were going to get an Airbnb in town and that she was going to drive out. She was hell-bent on being there the day I went into labor. Today, however, it became, everything is too much money. I didn't have enough time to ask for time off, and your dad wants to drive. My thoughts came to a screeching halt. Absolutely not. Then she followed it up with, "Don't worry, he knows you don't want to see or talk to him." I just sent back a text that said, "No thanks." I am actually seething. I just know they are going to pull some sympathy nonsense about, but he's our grandson. I already made it clear that until my father gives a formal apology to both me and my husband, I want nothing to do with him. On top of that, the excuses about time and money falling short seem off because they had plenty of time and money to go see my father's side of the family for his family reunion. That was an out-of-state trip plus 3 days of vacation expenses. It is just very clear where their priorities are. For my mother, who is a nurse making close to 6 figures a year, to have excuse after excuse about why they are struggling is just crazy to me. My husband and I make a combined total of about $3,000 per month, and we still find ways to save and make things happen when they need to happen. My mother is also very manipulative. She is making it seem like this is my fault despite the fact that I gave her all the information the moment I received it. She calls me crying every other day, talking about how much she misses me, how we're just not as close as we used to be, and how I am shutting her out of my pregnancy. I knew growing up that my parents were selfish, crazy, and immature, but seeing it so clearly now hurts a lot, and I really do not have the energy for this right now. Update. I gave birth on July 21st, 2026, to a healthy, enormous baby boy. I ended up in hard labor for 6 hours, with a total labor of 24 hours, and it ended in a shoulder dystocia delivery. My son never showed signs of fetal distress, so the care team avoided using forceps or a vacuum on him. It was very traumatic and exhausting, but neither of us suffered any injuries other than minor bruising. No tearing, nothing. That was thanks to my amazing husband and care team. Currently, I have taken a time out from seeing everyone until my body heals. As of now, we are all home, snuggled up on the couch and soaking up the moment. Anyway, thank you for watching.